There are crime scenes that announce themselves immediately. This wasn't one of them. On the morning of the 15th of December 2017, in one of Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods, everything looked normal. Cold air, quiet streets, a large house waiting to be shown. Nothing suggested that beneath that house, something was terribly wrong. My name is Panda. This is Panda Detective Bureau, and tonight I want to tell you about a case that still refuses to make sense, even years later. Just after 10 in the morning, a car pulled up in front of a massive home. 6 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, 3 floors, and one feature that made it unforgettable: an indoor swimming pool. 2 potential buyers stepped out of the car. Waiting for them was a real estate agent, Elisa. She had shown this house many times before. It belonged to Barry Sherman, a billionaire pharmaceutical executive, and his wife, Honey, to whom he had been married for 47 years. The Shermans were planning to sell and move closer to downtown Toronto, a normal decision for people with more money than most of us will ever see. That morning, Elisa had called the Shermans. No answer. Unusual but not alarming. She knew the house well, so she brought the buyers inside anyway. There were already 2 people there: a housekeeper who came twice a week, and a caretaker for the plants who came regularly as well. Outside, the Sherman's car was parked in the driveway. Inside, the house was quiet. Strange, but still explainable. Elisa did what she always did. She guided the buyers upstairs, showing them the enormous master bedroom, the spiral staircase, the luxury bathrooms, the details only people shopping at this level ever worry about. Then the main floor, the oversized kitchen, the dining area, the endless bathrooms. Everything was exactly as expected. Finally, they headed downstairs, the lowest level of the house, the largest space. Elisa showed them the garage, the sauna, a private home theater, and then they approached the indoor pool. Elisa walked ahead. She opened the door, and in that 1 or 2 seconds, before she closed it again, she saw something that made no sense at all. 2 people sitting at the edge of the pool, not swimming, not relaxing, fully dressed, coats on, shoes on. Their bodies were stiff, unmoving. Something appeared to be looped around their necks. It didn't register immediately as death, but it felt wrong, very wrong. Elisa reacted instantly. She closed the door, turned to the buyers, smiled, and said the pool area wouldn't be available to view today. If they were still interested, they could come back another time. Then she escorted them out of the house. Only after the buyers were gone did her hands start to shake. Elisa returned inside, but she didn't go downstairs herself. Instead, she asked the housekeeper to check the pool area. A few minutes later, the housekeeper came back upstairs. Her face had turned white. She told Elisa to call the police. The 2 people downstairs were dead. They were Barry and Honey Sherman. Elisa did not call the police immediately. Instead, she called Mary, Honey Sherman's sister, the family member responsible for handling the sale of the house. Mary contacted the Shermans' 4 children only after that. Nearly 90 minutes later, did the police receive the call. That delay would later become one of many unanswered questions. By noon, police, firefighters, and paramedics filled the property. Seasoned professionals, many of whom would later say they had never seen anything like this. The bodies had been dead for some time. The heated pool and humid air made determining the exact time of death difficult, but it was clear this hadn't happened that morning. What stunned everyone was not just that they were dead, it was how they were positioned. Barry Sherman was seated, his back facing the pool, one leg extended, the other crossed neatly over it. His jacket had been pulled up to hold his arms tightly against his sides. His glasses sat perfectly on his face, as if he were still alive. Honey sat beside him, upright, composed, her coat pulled up in the same way. And then, investigators noticed something else. Across the pool, in another room, stood a sculpture of a man and a woman seated in almost the exact same pose. The resemblance was unmistakable. The bodies had been posed. Each of them had a belt around their neck. The other end of each belt was tied to the pool's metal railing. That was how the bodies remained upright, not collapsed, not slumped, frozen. When police first secured the house, nothing about the scene felt simple. Not the position of the bodies, not the setting, not the details. But, within hours, a conclusion began to form, and it formed quietly. Officers who arrived at the scene did what they were trained to do. They documented everything: the pool room, the belts, the railing, the stillness. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no shattered windows. Nothing appeared to be missing. From the outside, the house looked untouched. That fact weighed heavily. Not long after, police began leaning toward a possibility that would later dominate early reports: a murder-suicide. The idea was that Barry Sherman had taken his wife's life, and then his own. It was not announced immediately, but it circulated, and once it did, it became difficult to dislodge. Barry Sherman was known to be a difficult man, brilliant, driven, but also combative. He had ongoing business disputes, legal conflicts, people who openly disliked him. To some investigators, that made him a plausible suspect, even in his own death. There was also no obvious third party, no fingerprints, no DNA pointing elsewhere, and so the simplest explanation began to feel acceptable. The Sherman family learned of the theory through the media, not through police, and they rejected it immediately. They said it didn't fit Barry. It didn't fit Honey, and it didn't fit their marriage. Friends echoed the same thing. The Shermans had been planning a future. They were selling their home. They were making plans. Nothing suggested despair. Nothing suggested violence between them. As more information surfaced, the discomfort grew. The belts around their necks showed no clear signs that either person had struggled. There were no defensive injuries, no clear explanation for how both bodies remained upright without collapsing. And then there was the sculpture. The resemblance between the sculpture and the positioning of the bodies felt deliberate, too deliberate. Investigators began to use a word they rarely liked to use early on: staged. The posture, the symmetry, the calmness of the scene. It didn't resemble violence. It resembled presentation. And that raised a new question. If this was a murder-suicide, why go to such lengths? The autopsy results did not provide the clarity people hoped for. The cause of death was listed as ligature neck compression, but the manner of death, how it happened, and why, remained unclear. There were no obvious injuries that definitively proved who acted first, or whether a third person had been present at all. As days passed, the story refused to settle. Media coverage intensified. Former detectives, forensic experts, and criminologists began publicly questioning the initial theory. The phrase murder-suicide started to feel less like a conclusion and more like a placeholder. Eventually, Toronto police adjusted their language. They stopped using the term murder-suicide. The case was now listed as suspicious, not a homicide, not an accident, just unresolved. It was a subtle change, but it mattered. Calling a case suspicious is an admission that nothing fits cleanly, that the answers aren't obvious, that someone, somewhere, may be missing. Once police acknowledged the deaths were suspicious, attention shifted outward, away from the pool room, away from the house, toward the lives Barry and Honey Sherman had lived before that morning. And almost immediately, one thing became clear. If this was a homicide, there was no shortage of people who might have wanted Barry Sherman gone. Barry Sherman was not a subtle businessman. He was aggressive, litigious, unapologetic. As the founder of Apotex, one of the world's largest generic drug companies, he had disrupted entire markets. That disruption created wealth. It also created resentment. Competitors accused him of unfair practices. Former partners accused him of betrayal. Governments accused him of pushing boundaries. Barry fought back constantly. Courtrooms were familiar territory. So were threats. But none of that was new. At the time of his death, Barry Sherman was involved in multiple major legal battles. Some involved hundreds of millions of dollars. Others involved people who had lost everything. To investigators, this immediately raised flags. Money has always been a powerful motive, but motive alone doesn't explain method. And it doesn't explain Honey. Honey Sherman was not involved in Barry's business disputes. She wasn't named in lawsuits. She didn't attend court. She focused on philanthropy, art, and community organizations. If this was about revenge, why include her? If this was about money, why leave everything untouched? Nothing in the house was taken. No valuables missing. No documents stolen. The scene suggested purpose, but not profit. As investigators broadened their scope, another uncomfortable reality emerged. Not all potential conflicts came from outside the family. Barry had a complicated relationship with his children. Strong opinions, control, disagreements over succession. Some of those tensions were well known. But again, tension is not evidence. And police have repeatedly stated that the family is not considered suspects. Still, the speculation lingered. In cases involving wealth, it always does. Another question soon followed. How could something like this happen? In a house like that? The Shermans lived in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Toronto. Their home had security systems, alarms, cameras. But on that night, much of it didn't help. Some cameras weren't functioning. Some footage was missing. There was no clear record of anyone entering or leaving, which meant either no one else was there, or someone knew exactly how to move through the house unseen. As months passed, one thing became increasingly unsettling. Despite the money, despite the attention, despite the scrutiny, no suspect emerged. No arrests, no charges, no clear narrative. In a city with one of the most advanced police forces in the country, a double death involving a billionaire remained unresolved. And the longer it stayed that way, the louder the silence became. Eventually, the Sherman family hired private investigators, former homicide detectives, independent experts. Their conclusion was direct. This was a targeted, professional killing. They argued the scene had been staged to resemble something else, that whoever did this knew the house, knew the routine, and knew how to leave nothing behind. Police did not publicly agree, but they didn't dismiss it either. Years have now passed. The house was demolished, the land sold. Life in the neighborhood moved on. But the case did not. It remains open, active, unresolved, a file that refuses to close. As time passed, the Sherman case entered a strange phase. It wasn't forgotten, but it wasn't moving forward either. It existed in a kind of suspension, talked about, speculated on, but never resolved. From the outside, it looked like a case that should have been solved. There was money, there was motive, there was public attention. But inside the investigation, progress was uneven. Police reviewed timelines, revisited the house layout, re-examined forensic details. Again and again, each pass raised questions, but not answers. One possibility investigators had to consider. was deeply uncomfortable. What if this wasn't messy? Because it was poorly done. But because it was done well, there were no clear mistakes, no obvious panic. If someone else had been involved, they had left almost nothing behind, and crimes without errors are often harder to prove than crimes filled with them. As years went by, public frustration grew. Commentators questioned the investigation. Former detectives spoke openly about missed opportunities. People asked why so little information was being released. Police responded cautiously. Ongoing investigations rely on silence, they said, but silence cuts both ways. By this point, two narratives existed side by side. One said the case was complex, active, and ongoing. The other said it had stalled. Both could be true, because investigations don't always fail loudly. Sometimes they simply stop changing. Throughout all of this, the Sherman family maintained the same stance. They did not believe this was a murder-suicide. They continued to fund private efforts. They continued to press for answers. But they also understood something difficult. No amount of money can force clarity where evidence refuses to speak. With every year that passed, the case grew harder. Memories faded. Potential witnesses moved away. Physical locations changed. The house itself, the central stage of the crime, was gone, demolished. Whatever secrets it held went with it. Today, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrests, no charges, just questions. Questions about access, about timing, about intention, and about whether some answers may never be found. This isn't just a story about wealth or power. It's a story about limits, the limits of investigation, the limits of certainty, and the limits of closure. Some cases end with a verdict, others end with silence. And silence, as we've seen before, can be the hardest ending of all. There is a belief that every case has an ending, an arrest, a confession, a moment where everything finally makes sense. But the Sherman case never offered that. What it offered instead was permanence. For the Sherman family, life moved forward, but not cleanly. There were no final explanations to accept or reject, only theories, only fragments. They continued to fund investigations. They continued to speak publicly. But they also understood something quietly painful. Closure is not something you can demand. To the public, the case became symbolic. If a billionaire couple could die in their own home, in one of the safest neighborhoods in the country, without answers, what did that say? About safety, about justice, about certainty? The case wasn't frightening because of its violence. It was frightening because of its ambiguity. Over time, media attention faded. New cases replaced old ones. Headlines moved on. But the file remained open, not cold, not closed. Just waiting. Waiting for a piece of information that might never arrive. Humans are not built to live comfortably with unanswered questions. We want cause and effect. We want responsibility. When those things are missing, the mind fills in gaps. Speculation becomes narrative. Rumors harden into belief. And truth becomes harder to separate from what feels convincing. The Sherman case doesn't tell us who committed the crime. It tells us something else instead, that even with money, attention, and pressure, some truths remain unreachable. That justice is not guaranteed by resources alone, and that certainty is far rarer than we like to admit. Earlier, we talked about silence as something that can hide danger. Here, silence becomes something different. It becomes absence, an empty space where answers should be. And learning to live with that space may be the hardest part of all. This has been Panda Detective Bureau. Thank you for listening. Not just for the mystery, but for the uncertainty. Because sometimes the most honest ending is admitting that we don't know. Until next time, take care.